But now I'd like to introduce Jonnie McConnell and his paper, Eco-phenomenology, Literature, and Environmental Ethics.
The sort of trinity of phenomenology, literature, and the environment is historically apparent, perhaps nowhere so immediately as the title of Martin Heidegger's lecture, Poetically Man Dwells. This phrase, taken of course from the line of Husserl, reads, full of merit, yet poetically, man dwells on this earth. Asks us to think of man's being as dwelling on earth and poetry as a letting dwell of this being. Dwelling poetically is a taking measure that cares for the earth. We could even go so far as to say that Heidegger prefigures the politics of sustainability when he quotes from Sophocles, for kindness it is that ever calls forth kindness. Still speaking, historically, we can take a step back in time and across the Atlantic to Henry David Thoreau's masterpiece, Walden, long considered a foundational text for American political nature writing, and later deeply analyzed by geocriticism. Walden should also be understood as part of a parallel development of phenomenology. Although published half a century before Husserl developed the idea that epoche is the phenomenological bracketing of non-essential qualities to get to the heart of an experience, I think it's how we should read Thoreau's most famous passage, right? He says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, skip ahead, to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. I think that's prefiguring the epoche. So phenomenology has always been concerned with nature, or the world, or the environment, and all the polyvalent ways that those terms are deployed. Much more recently, we started to extend this theoretical concern to the practical concerns of environmental activism, most explicitly in the 2003 movement-defining volume titled Eco-phenomenology, Back to the Earth Itself, edited by Ted Todvine and Charles S. Brown. So as a movement, eco-phenomenology separates itself from classical phenomenology, because rather than merely being broadly critical of the mind-world divide or naturalism or something of that sort, it adds a specific ethical task to motivate that critique towards solving 21st century environmental crises. But rather than talk abstractly about historical movements and competing philosophical systems, I'm going to offer you my attempts to think through a particular problem of environmental ethics. So I'm going to do like an applied sort of thing here, rather than theoretical. And I specifically want to keep in mind a statement from Erazim Kohák in his Eco-phenomenology essay. He says, the move from empirical ways of knowing to phenomenology is in part a shift from the naivete of approaching reality as a set of space-time objects and causal relations to approaching it as a system of interlocking roles. And here's my problem. I'm going to give some examples here. Last November, during a hunting trip with my dad, I casually brought up an ongoing legal debate over high-fence deer hunting in Indiana. If you don't know what high-fence hunting is, it's this weird system where people are breeding deers in enclosed spaces, so they're not part of the public herds. People come in and shoot them, like pay to shoot, and they call it hunting. The Department of Natural Resources claims that canned hunting businesses are illegal because all wildlife is common property of the people of Indiana instead of public trust. However, there are several of these private hunting preserves operating around the state while the legal and legislative issues are playing out. To my surprise, my dad's opinion is that if those deer were bought and raised separately from the state game herds, then they are private property and the owners could do with them whatever they want. Even though the idea of trophy hunting in general and canned hunting in particular goes against what my family values as the essence of hunting, which is hunting for food and with respect for life. The trump card for my dad, to my amazement, is that there's this doctrine of private property. That's what mattered. So to approach this problem in an eco-phenomenological way, I will offer three competing ontological accounts of the human-deer relationship. And by ontological here, I simply mean that the being of the things we encounter in the world, and therefore our own being, is revealed by the way in which we encounter them. And that might not be super rigorous, but it's something I can use going through life. Like it's an easy shorthand. Additionally, to have a respect for life as applied to non-human animals, I'm trying to encourage a comportment toward the animal that does not radically limit it as merely an object in a causal use-based network. Ontological respect for life would mean allowing that thing, the animal, to come into being alongside ourselves in a relationship that is not foreclosed or overdetermined. Adding to this sort of phenomenology, I want to add Iris Marion Young's concept of social justice. She says, quote, I suggest that social justice means the elimination of institutionalized domination and oppression. Any aspect of social organization and practice relevant to domination and oppression is in principle subject to evaluation by ideas of justice, unquote. Institutionalized domination and oppression is what I want to key in on there. So now we're primed to accept the apparent paradox of hunting, the competing claims of trying to kill an animal whose freedom you say you celebrate. I find a way out of this paradox or kind of argument my dad has used many times, but that I never quite agreed with. When talking to anti-hunters who happily eat meat from the grocery store, my dad would say something like, well, at least the deer I shot today had a chance, whereas the pig you're eating was bred and born and was to be killed. I still don't like the phrase, they had a chance. I think it resonates with attitudes of complacency around all kinds of institutional oppression, where one success story is trotted out to deny that such oppression exists. However, in the context of relationships between humans and animals in general, it had a chance expresses a value system that places less determined interspecies relationships at a higher priority than overdetermined interspecies relationships. To speak ontologically, an intensive feedlot domesticated pig is a kind of thing without possibilities, while a white-tailed deer in the field and forest of the Midwest is a kind of thing whose possibilities both interpenetrate the possibilities of humans and exceed those human relationships, even when we're hunting them with it. In the interest of interspecies social justice, then, we have a duty to encourage the kinds of relationships hunters have with deer and discourage the kind of relationships consumers have with factory farm meat. So here's my three phenomenological descriptions. One, last fall, my family, on our way home from the pumpkin patch, passed a freshly killed deer mangled in a heap on the side of the road. A few dozen yards farther down the road was a car on the shoulder, shattered windshield, and front quarter pedal bashed in. In the car, still in the car, sat a man talking on his cell phone and waving his arms around. I could clearly imagine his conversation to 911 or his spouse, whoever he was calling. You know, I don't know what happened. It just jumped in front of me. Or to use the language of Paul Virilio, one of Merleau-Ponty's students, the dead deer is what crops up. For Virilio, our perceptions and experiences are flattened by the speed of modern life, so that we encounter the world as if looking through a car windshield, which at highway speeds becomes a flat screen in which things crop up. Lost is all depth perception and peripheral vision. All we have is speed, the flat screen, self in the world, and the accident. Example number 2. Seeing that shattered deer and shattered car and shattered perceptual field of the driver, I thought back to a recent experience I had deer hunting. Walking into the woods before dark, finding my spot against a downed tree at the edge of the clearing, sitting quietly while the woods slowly came awake with the pre-dawn light, thinking about how the slope of land should funnel deer into the clearing just opposite where I'm sitting. Every so often, moving my hand down super slowly before another shot of coffee from my thermos, the movements and sounds of the woods jumping directly into my immediate and reflective consciousness almost simultaneously, and then amazingly, a deer appearing right where I expected her to. In a sense, both of these first two descriptions have the same objective outcome, the violent death of a deer. The second deer, however, became nourishment for my family that winter, and the eating of that food reverberated with the experience of that slow, cold morning in the woods. I'm not just claiming that this example exhibits a better use value of an object, in the name of, say, sustainability or something like that, but that the being of the thing, in this case a deer, changes based on the relationship. And also the being of the humans involved is radically different, even from, we can speculate, the perspective of the deer. As hazards, perhaps, the hunter human and the motorist human occupy different niches in the fabric of the deer world. And now I want to add a third possible phenomenology of deer. This from an Indianapolis Star newspaper report on canned hunting. This passage describes a video made at one of the deer farms, and it was available for a time to watch on YouTube. The video opens with 5 men wrestling a white-tailed buck into a metal chute. The deer's eyeballs bulge as the animal thrashes in pure terror. One man crams a cup-like device wrapped in duct tape over the buck's mouth and nose, is connected to a tube pumping tranquilizer pads. They wrap a pink blanket over the buck's eyes. Its thrashing slowly subsides. One of the men gets to work on the deer's hindquarters. He inserts a probe into the deer's anus and places a camouflage-covered bag with a funnel attachment over the deer's genitals. He gradually turns a knob on a yellow box. The deer's back legs shake as the probe's electric current causes the deer to ejaculate into the funnel. After collecting the semen, the men saw off the animal's antlers for safety in the pen. Sorry, that's it. So beyond the sadistic electrosexual violation of this buck, which is an atrocity on, we might say, the ontic level, I want to call your attention to the instrumentalization of life itself, which is an ontological violence. The buck with desirable characteristics is reduced to the use value of those genetic traits, which are isolated, physically and metaphorically wrenched from his body to be reassembled into a product fit to be sold in a one-to-one market exchange. Often these clients at these hunting ranches pick out a specific buck, kill them, and then pay based on like rack size measurement or something. So it's just a regular exchange, not market exchange. Some of the animals bred in this manner are simply grotesque, with racks many times larger than the average wild animal would produce, so that they stagger under the weight of this bizarre, scientifically produced fetish. So when talking about institutionalized domination and repression, Young's phrase, we should not consider if there's a magnitude of evil in the domination, not only of individuals, but of species and of kinds. An objectivist perspective may insist that we're still talking about white-tailed deer, but my phenomenology tells us that the interspecies relationship, constitutive of the concept of deer, has been corrupted into something with no similarity either to our hunting or our road hazard experiences. So with these three examples, I've tried to show how a phenomenological method reveals three kinds of things that are all uncritically called deer. The road hazard revealed through technological speed is what crops up in the accidental, a hunted being that is encountered through lived experience, and which then sustains other life as food, and a fully overcoded object of scientific rationality tailored to the fetish market. This meditation that I'm calling a phenomenology all came out of trying to work through my dad's surprising acceptance of canned hunting preserves based on an ideology of private property rights. But the key to this whole project was also inspired by the following passage from William Faulkner's novel, Go Down, Moses. This is the literature part of the whole literature, phenomenology, environmentalism. To summarize a bit, if you don't know the novel, in this scene, Isaac renounces his claim to his birthright, the McConnell plantation with its violent history of plantation life. Slavery, rape, miscegenation, incest, all these Faulknerian themes, a history that is metaphysically tied to the enclosure of wild land by white colonists. In this passage, Icomatubi is a Chickasaw chief who sold the land to the white people. So quote, Isaac talking to his cousin. I can't repudiate it. It was never mine to repudiate. It was never father's and Uncle Buddy's to bequeath me to repudiate. Because it was never grandfather's to bequeath them to bequeath me to repudiate. Because it was never old Icomatubi's to sell to grandfather for bequeathment and repudiation. Because it was never Icomatubi's father's to bequeath Icomatubi to sell to grandfather or any man. Because on the instant when Icomatubi realized that he could sell it for money, on that instant it ceased ever to have been his forever, father to father to father, and the man who bought it, when he realized he could sell it for money, it ceased ever to have been his forever, father to father to father. The temporal and ontological slipperiness of Faulkner's language illuminates what is at stake in the shifting interspecies relationships I've been talking about. Or to return to Heidegger's language, maybe Faulkner's poetry provides the measure of man and his dwelling under the Godhead. In the same way that the land which would become the McConnell plantation changes nature instantly across generations and temporalities by being captured by the technology of exchange value, if we allow the pay-to-shoot killing of genetically dominated and charted animals to be called hunting, in the nature of hunting, the nature of deer, this particular possibility of procuring food from the commons of public trust rather than our commodity supermarkets, is lost not only for our own and future generations, but for past understandings of hunting as well. The ontological violence extends both directions in time. Okay, so I chose this example of deer for my eco-phenomenological demonstration in part because it opens up some of the challenges of the method. For one, there are probably some of you, or maybe a lot of you, who think I'm guilty of the worst kind of anthropocentrism, a common charge against phenomenology and much environmental thought. After all, in all of my examples, the human-world relationships, the animal is either killed or tortured, and I can offer only an explanation for what that violence means to the human participant in the relationship. In Heidegger's infamous formulation, the animal is world poor, right? But even if we believe this, it certainly does not follow that their being world poor relieves us of an ethical commitment toward them. Ted Toadvine, the editor of Eco-phenomenology, goes farther and says, quote, "Nor can Heidegger's insistence on a radical distinction between human and animal be dismissed as a consequence of the peculiarities of his own interpretation of phenomenology. Rather, the animal-human distinction goes to the heart, not only of the phenomenological method, but of philosophy itself." Toadvine goes on to say that thinking through this relation of humans with other animals and with nature in general goes to the heart of the problem which has traditionally been expressed as a contrast between life and spirit. I also chose this example because it's hard and it has consequences. I think a lot of things in phenomenology are very trivial things. But the other difficulty, perhaps my example confronts, is one of scale and political action. The practical difficulty of promoting diverse micro-resistance solutions to a world that is engulfed by totalities. We all know, for example, that pursuing monoculture-based global commodity market food paradigms is a mistake for many reasons: ecological, ethical, economical, and otherwise. Despite this, when I talk about hunting as a way of sidestepping the dominant capitalist paradigm of food distribution, I often hear the accusation of, well, there's not enough deer for everyone to live off of them. Similarly, when talking about farmers markets or backyard gardens, we hear the criticism that those are merely trendy options for a privileged minority with the time, space, and money to spare. People seem to clamor for a solution to totalitarianism that is itself a totality. The idea that an ecological conformity to the world may manifest itself in a diverse array of tactics while being part of a unified strategy of changing perspectives and challenging a history of destruction seems to be unsatisfactory to many people. But I believe, with what may be more conviction than reason, that a phenomenological comportment towards ecological issues, very largely construed, meaning, for example, urban spaces, or as right for eco-phenomenology in this traditional, quote, natural spaces. This sort of comportment does provide an answer for our larger environmental problems. In my example, although framed as this sort of family discussion over what is essential to the nature of hunting, the life-worldly repercussions are extended outward. Historically, for instance, some of the earliest and most widespread environmental protection efforts were undertaken by hunters and fishermen for obvious reasons. Every meal procured through access to the commons rather than enclosed monetized space is a resistance to agribusiness and commodity culture at large. State agencies respond to this public demand by reclaiming private property for the public good. The do-it-yourself ethos permeates this relationship, cultivating similar anti-marketplace trajectories. And in fact, I think we're on the cusp of a very interesting intermingling of the far right and far left in America, based on a shared interest in self-sufficiency and suspicion of the business world. In short, encouraging the kind of human-animal relationship of the hunter of the commons and dissuading the highway accident relationships and the genetically manipulated camp hunting relationships extends in effect throughout a web of ecologically connected resistances, all the way up to climate change, our most apocalyptic environmental crisis. This, in conclusion, is my maybe somewhat utopian claim, that vacillating perspectives back and forth from background political ethical commitments such as environmentalism to phenomenological descriptions of experience reveals the real consequences of our attitudes toward the natural world and allows us to chart a trajectory towards establishing a less destructive future.
Questions for Jonnie, and you've been good in the field of your own questions.
just wanted to pick up on the phrase less destructive, because I like the idea of it, but let's say I was doing deconstruction 101 and I wanted to ask, what's the condition for the possibility of the lived experience, or the supposedly proper, more natural, less technological? And it seems to me the word is techno, which is somehow not lived, right? But the condition, so if I'm just doing my, Derridean rap, I would say the condition for the possibility of your lived experience is techno. Right? You have to have a gun, a thermos, a car to get you out there. And so that this supposed distinction between the Virilio, well, let's not even talk about the biopolitical paradigm of birth, cannot be one that's ontological. It comes in by moral fear, this notion. And so there's one sense in which this phrase, less destructive, comes in, deus ex machina at the end, and lives the lie of the complicity between the hunter that goes out and that isn't the canned high-fence hunter, and isn't the person consuming meat from wherever. But yet is the condition, the possibility of their activity is still bound up with the same system. So it's not that it has to be absolutely pure. I take you there. That's where the lesser violence is still better than the worse violence. But there still seems to me that there's a problem in this conception of less destructive and how you validate it. Once the condition for the possibility of the less destructive is precisely the same thing that enables technoscience and driving.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure that I agree that the condition of the possibility is the same. And there's a whole variety of ways you can be encountering nature in this way. One of the pieces, this piece, the small selection here is from a much larger piece, I actually presented with a panel of vegans and raw foodists, and I was more engaged with that specific discussion. So it was more like, there's no such thing as stepping back. Like Peter Singer talks about hunting, says somewhere compared to domesticated animals, the animals living in the woods like deer that we hunt would be happy and free if we just left them alone. And that's never been true, right? Yeah. So you're technically, there's never been a natural world, there's never been a human, of course, right?
Yeah.
So it is a continuum. And the particular way, I'm trying to get to your specific question. It's just a continuum. We're always engaged, and it's always back and forth. Deer have never been outside of human. In North America, last 10,000 years, whatever. We've managed land for them. I don't know. I think that's all my answer. It's specific. It's against a perfectionism in environmental thought and food ethics and animal ethics. There's always this sort of perfectionist thing. So that's why less destructive came in. And I don't think I answered your question about techne specifically, but I'm pushing back against the perfectionism and against an either or and an absolute dogma.
No, I think you did answer it if you say that the deer are technological.
Right.
And then I'm fine. Then it's a more or less. Yeah.
I was actually, as you were talking, and I'm going to ask you to make sense of something that I experienced, which is totally unfair, so I'm sorry, I apologize in advance for that. As you were talking, I was struck by something that happened on the college campus I went to, Object College in Baltimore. It's really tiny, hippie-dippy school that could very crunchy, very lots of animals, activists and such there. And we had a deer problem, right?
Yeah.
A deer problem. Basically, we've developed the school, typical, right? And then there's less room, just as many deer. Deer running around through their quads, people freaking out. Seriously, it was a thing during mating season. People were afraid to leave the dorms. I thought it was hilarious. And so anyway, what happened was there was the solution that was arranged was a hunt, an organized hunt, where ostensibly we would get into homeless shelters. So it was something that sort of seemed to try to appeal to everyone in this way. That it was sort of less destructive, less destructive, but
yeah. And part of the problem is that we've killed all of the natural predators in North America. So,
Yeah.
and then we've taken our habitat. So you have these pressures, right? And there's no getting away from the fact that populations have pressures on each other.
Yeah, but anyway, what it was interesting was, so this was arranged, and 2 days before this was arranged, someone on the campus had to take it upon themselves to begin the hunt, I suppose, on their own. And shot a deer. It is funny, but then it kind of goes horrible. So I'm just gonna warn you, someone shot a deer with an arrow, bow and arrow, not like a Ted Nugent bow and arrow either, like a, regular bow and arrow. And it took, they suspect it's probably the body was found and probably died from a collapsed lung, which very slow people dead. And just thinking about this problem of less destructive, that the solutions that we come to, that they, I don't know, that sometimes what they open up is more horrible than what they try to close off. And I don't know how to, it's the thing I have never had the opportunity to have anyone help me explain
So again,
or experience. So.
if I understand.
So sorry, I know that was
Yeah.
Real quick. So
Long
just
run.
again, it's kind of this like perfectionist thing, the less destructive. There's a good book by Jacques Derrida, or actually he has a good essay called Hunting Like a Vegetarian, and he wrote a mediocre book called The Mindful Carnivore after it. But he was a vegan for years and years, and he found out his organic farmer that he buys all his vegetable from at the farmer's markets and smoke bombing and gopher or chemical bombing them to kill them all. And he starts thinking about all the death involved in his like crunchiest, like best veggies he gets from the farmer he knows. And like that's why this example is good. Like you're on your campus or whatever, you're always pushing against these violent relationships that you can't avoid in life. Like absolutely, if we're gonna live here, other things are gonna die. So sorry, that probably makes sense.
You take care.
It was my fault, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go